Hello, geography students. I want to go through the chapter 9 and actually chapter 9 through 11 test review on Latin America. So what you can expect on the test on either Thursday or Friday when you come to class, there are 14 multiple choice questions on, basically the chapters of the material. There's 10 multiple choice questions on the map that I had given you on those landforms and countries and capitals, and then there's one essay question. So let's start with the landforms. It's important to know the mountains and the significance of the mountains of Latin America. The Sierra Madres are essentially in Mexico. They pretty much take up all of Mexico. Mexico is very mountainous country. And then the Andes. And the Andes are really the backbone of South America. If you think of the backbone as the Pacific side of America, and it has what has allowed for the human-environment interaction, especially when we talk about ancient civilizations or old civilizations such as the Incas. Because of the mountainous areas of Latin America, terrace farming had to be implemented. Terrace farming is an ancient technique that's used to grow crops on mountains and hills. They do this by cutting steps into mountains to cultivate crops. If you were a peoples or a tribe or a village, a city that lived near or on a mountain, you had to figure out how to feed yourself. You had to cultivate food to be self-sufficient, and you would do that through terrace farming. Now that means that you wouldn't do it on a large scale. You would probably do it enough to be self-sufficient, maybe sell a little bit to those who live around you, but it would not be for large-scale purposes. There are important rivers, and probably the most important one in Latin America is the Amazon. It is the largest river in the world. It is not the longest, but it is the largest. It begins in the Andes, way in the west, and it flows all the way across South America, the northern part of South America, to the Atlantic. The Orinoco River begins in the hills of Venezuela, and it kind of skirts the border of Venezuela and Colombia, and it flows also into the Atlantic Ocean. Those are the only two rivers, actually, that I need you to know. The Panama Canal, although this is not a river and it's a canal, it's important to understand that this was a waterway that connected the Caribbean and the Pacific. If you watch that video, this was a man-made canal, a complete feat of engineering that cut travel and trade routes in half. It's about a 50-mile wide ditch that they dug. I mean, absolutely amazing, connecting the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. The highlands of the Guiana highlands and the Brazilian highlands, these are important areas. They are smaller than mountains, but it also has very much attributed to the way people and the environment operate. The Cerrado is the Brazilian interior with a flat terrain. The Cerrado is good for farming. We saw this a bit in the video, the short clip that we watched on the Amazon rainforest. They needed more of this area to grow farms, and so that's why they cleared off the Amazon rainforest. Pampas. The Pampas are the grasslands of Argentina and Uruguay. This is where we see, you remember the South American cowboy, the gauchos, where they raise cattle, they herd cattle, they raise grain crops. And so think of the Pampas as kind of like, if you wanted to compare it to the American Southwest, the whole area of Texas and New Mexico and Colorado, and those areas that would have been good for raising livestock as well as probably some crops as well. The Llanos are this treeless grassy plain in Colombia and Venezuela. Lots of natural resources in the Llanos and kind of an open grassy plains area, much more like we would be familiar here in in the Midwest. Urbanization, we've talked about this word more than once. It's the dramatic rise in the population of cities and changes in lifestyle. So when I say changes in lifestyle, this dramatic population increase results in things like the need for more infrastructure, building more things like roads and bridges and sewer systems and schools, and building things to help people. But it also results in things like pollution, in more jobs, but maybe not enough jobs. So it could result in poverty. Just a lack of space. You have to build up instead of out because there's no more space to be had. So urbanization is kind of a good thing and a bad thing. We see the positive and negative effects of urbanization. So the biggest part that I want you to remember for this test is how the cultures of Latin America developed and why they developed the way they did. We'll start with the cultures of Mexico. Originally, this is the Aztecs and the Mayans. They were dominated by the Spanish, and we know, of course, this Spanish influence is because of the Columbian Exchange. We'll talk about again here in a minute. They were forced to adopt the language of the Spanish, the religion of the Spanish, which almost exclusively was Catholicism, and the cultural attitudes of the Spanish. Now, that doesn't mean they completely let go of their own cultural attitudes, but some of those other characteristics might have been forced upon some of the original indigenous people of Mexico. The cultures of Peru. We see this incredible Incan civilization that was very advanced. They lived along the Andes. They were conquered by the Spanish for their gold and silver mines. However, because of the extent of their civilization, how big it was and how advanced it was, even though the Spanish dominated over the Peruvians, over the Incans, there's still some remnants of the Incan civilization that exists today, especially in their language. Quechua is a language that is still spoken by millions of native people in Peru. The cultures of actually the Caribbean, that was my fault. I didn't, I meant to put the Caribbean and not Central America. I combined the cultures of Mexico with the Aztecs and the Mayans. So the cultures of the Caribbean, what I do want you to understand there, and I apologize for not having anything written, is how the Caribbean developed much on the what's the word I'm looking for? Slave trade. So because of the diseases that Columbus brought over in the form of smallpox, it killed off a large amount of the population. When there was very few people who were still in the Caribbean to labor for Spanish settlers, Spanish conquistadors, they switched on their laboring methods to the Atlantic slave trade in order to kidnap slaves from Africa. So today, the Caribbean is very much a mixture of indigenous people of the Caribbean, of Africans from Africa, and of Europeans from Spain. So it's a real combination of cultures in the Caribbean. So the Columbian Exchange. This is the exchange of goods, people, and diseases between Europe and the Americas. What's interesting is that Europe brought over a lot of diseases, but the Americas didn't have a lot of diseases that made the Europeans sick. It was really only the other way. But we see lots of different goods and foods especially being exchanged, people, unfortunately, being exchanged, and disease. So the effects of the Columbian Exchange. Disease killed about 90% of the native people in some areas, especially in areas of Mexico and the Caribbean, which in turn caused slavery to begin. So cultures were blended between European, indigenous, and African cultures. This is what we had talked about in the Caribbean mostly, but also other areas as well. The effects of the Columbian Exchange, that the religion that was brought into the Americas was often Catholic because of the strength of the Portuguese, because of the strength of the Spanish, the French. Those were all predominantly Catholic cultures. Now, when we see the Americas start to be settled, or North America start to be settled, especially in the United States, or what we call the United States now, that was more of a Protestant religion, still Christian, but a Protestant religion from England. The language in Latin America tended to be Spanish in all areas west of the Treaty of Tordesillas line, and it tended to be Portuguese in Brazil to the east of that imaginary line. So that's really what I want you to understand about the Treaty of Tordesillas. It was this imaginary line that granted control to the east, which was Portugal, and to the west, which was Spain. And so the impact of European language and religion is still evident today in pretty much all of Latin America. And also the effects of the Columbian Exchange, you cannot forget about the development of slavery. Because of the disease and the abundance of natural resources, slavery began as a way to use human labor from Africa as a part of the slave trade, where human beings would have been taken from their lands in Africa, sent on ships to places like Brazil or South America, in the Caribbean islands, to an extent in Mexico, but probably not so much, to work to get those natural resources to send back to areas such as Europe, Spain, Britain later on. So hint, hint, nudge, nudge, your essay is probably going to be about this idea of the effects of the Columbian Exchange. Make sure you know all of the nations, the capitals, and the landforms. Be familiar with those. There are 10 multiple choice questions on some of those as well. If you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to send me a Teams chat or an email, and I can answer any questions you might have. Good luck, and I'll see you on Thursday or Friday.